Hi, welcome to our March Arts Saturday reading and Q&A. I'm Diane McGarry with Dracut Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Hamid Zaman, and ASL interpreter Shelley. Mohammed is a Howard Hughes Medical Institute professor of biomedical engineering at Boston University. A major research theme in his lab focuses on developing solutions to improve access to quality care in low-income settings, including in refugee settlements. In addition to over 130 peer-reviewed research articles, he has also authored 2 books for broad audiences. His first book, Bitter Pills, looks at the global challenge of substandard and counterfeit drugs. His second book, Biography of Resistance, is focused on global antimicrobial resistance. It is a story of science and evolution that looks to history, culture, attitudes, and our own individual choices and collective human behavior in creating one of the biggest healthcare challenges in our time. Mohammed has also developed research and education programs focusing on refugee health at Boston University. He co-founded the university-wide initiative on forced displacement in collaboration with academic, public, and private sector partners in Lebanon, Uganda, and Colombia. Mohammed has written extensively on innovation, refugee, and global health in newspapers around the world. His newspaper columns have appeared in over 30 countries and have been translated into 8 languages. He has won numerous awards for his teaching and research, most recently being the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2020. His work on antibiotic resistance in refugee camps was highlighted then. So thank you so much for being with us today, Mohammed.
My pleasure.
So what are you working on, and what were you going to share with us today?
So what I was going to talk about was recognizing the importance of the challenge of antimicrobial resistance. One of the chapters from the book, this particular chapter is called The Navy Boys. This is a particular chapter about the contribution of one particular young lieutenant in the Navy, somebody who I got to know much later in life, Lieutenant King Holmes, and his discovery that is still used to tackle a particularly nasty form of antimicrobial resistance, and sort of his journey in discovering. And I'll be happy to take any questions or reflect on both this chapter and my meetings with Dr. Holmes and others.
Thank you very much.
All right. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So this is a chapter almost right in the middle of the book called Biography of Resistance, the epic battle between people and pathogens. On the other side of the Cold War divide, and almost literally on the other side of the world, a young doctor, Lieutenant King K. Holmes, was also confronting the challenge of mounting cases of drug-resistant bacterial infections. Through his research, Holmes realized that discovering new ways to prevent the spread of infections was just as crucial as discovering new lines of antibiotics. Holmes was a recent recruit to the Navy. A graduate of Harvard, he went on to secure his MD at Weill Cornell, followed by a prestigious internship at Vanderbilt University. While he was at Vanderbilt, Captain Herbert Stockline, a Navy recruiter, called Holmes to let him know that he was soon to be drafted for the war in Vietnam. Holmes was slotted to be sent to the Mojave Desert to be part of the Public Health Service Commission Corps. But Holmes was not interested in the Public Health Corps, so he made a counteroffer. He told Stockline that he was willing to work for 3 years, instead of 2 that were required by the government, if he could be stationed in Hawaii or the Philippines, where he could work on infectious disease. Stockline agreed. So during the war, Holmes was stationed on the USS Enterprise, a naval vessel with an illustrious past. This name has been reserved for special ships. Over the course of the U.S. history, 8 American naval vessels have been given the name, beginning with the British ship that the Americans captured in 1775. At the height of the Vietnam War, the name had been given to one of the prides of the U.S. fleet, the first ever nuclear-powered aircraft carrier deployed in the Pacific. Holmes was assigned to the preventive medicine unit on USS Enterprise, where the doctors encountered the problem of recurring infection among the sailors. Holmes was required to spend part of his time in the Pearl Harbor and part of it on the ship. But in Pearl Harbor, he located an old Harvard instructor, Claire Folsom, who was running a microbiology lab at the University of Hawaii. When King asked to join the lab, Dr. Folsom gladly agreed. And while there, King started learning epidemiology from researchers at the University of Hawaii. Before long, the USS Enterprise was docked at Subic Bay in the Philippines. Subic Bay is about 60 miles northwest of Manila and is about the size of Singapore. By the time Holmes arrived, the war in Vietnam was raging full, and the bay had been transformed. It was not just a naval station built by the US military, it was a world unto itself. One of the largest stations for the logistics ever built. It was the hub of wartime transportation and military coordination, which meant it was teeming with military personnel. Over 40 ships at a time could dock there. And in 1967 alone, more than 4 million sailors visited the bay on their way to war or on their way back home. Such a large number of servicemen in the region was a boon for local trade and commerce. The Navy servicemen who were off duty would go into the town and visit the local bars, nightclubs, brothels, and sometimes for entire weekends. Once back on the ship, however, many started complaining of a urethral discharge that the naval doctors soon diagnosed as gonorrhea. By the time King reached the Enterprise, the number of infected servicemen was escalating, and people were really concerned. Operating under this assumption that all of the cases were indeed cases of gonorrhea, the doctors followed the standard treatment protocol at the time and prescribed penicillin to the afflicted servicemen. But when King took up his post, nearly half of the servicemen weren't responding to the drug at all. Holmes found the failure rate quite troubling. He collected samples of urethral discharge and took them back to his old lab in Hawaii. As he studied the culture of the discharge to understand why the standard penicillin was ineffective, he was surprised to find that about half of the discharge was not gonorrhea at all. It was, in fact, non-gonococcal urethritis, an infection caused by pathogens other than gonorrhea. The half that was gonorrhea, however, exhibited signs of a serious drug resistance. The treatment failure that the doctors witnessed at Subic Bay were due in part due to misdiagnosis and in part due to drug resistance. Holmes figured out that the first part of the problem was easy. Some of the men presented with symptoms similar to gonorrhea, but were actually suffering from infection already known to be insensitive to penicillin. These patients simply needed a different drug. The bigger and the harder question was why those servicemen who had contacted gonorrhea were not responding to penicillin at all. Holmes had to be more than a preventive medic, more than even a microbiologist. He would need to become a field epidemiologist. In other words, a disease detective. What Holmes would do next would go far beyond US Navy guidelines in the Subic Bay. It would change the guidelines for the treatment of drug-resistant gonorrhea throughout the world until this day. Holmes started his field investigation in one of the major settlements on Subic Bay. Olongapo was home to nearly 5,000 sex workers, and every day about 250 of them would appear at the one clinic in town for a monthly health checkup. The patients would line up to see the one female doctor running the clinic. Holmes knew that if he hoped to understand the reasons why the disease was spreading among the Navy men, he had to start at this clinic where the sex workers were being screened. The local doctor used a single speculum, a standard tool for vaginal examination. For efficiency's sake, she kept a large bucket of water nearby to rinse the speculum after she had completed an exam. He would then continue in this way, seeing patients one by one, rinsing the speculum in the same bucket of water. As he observed the doctor's clinic, King had found his first clue. The doctor's examination practice, and especially that bucket of water, was a major source of infection that was spreading among the sex workers and the sailors. This explained the spread of infection, but not the bacterial resistance. Holmes turned to the medicine that the doctors were giving to the women. The standard treatment for those who showed signs of gonorrhea was benzathine penicillin, rather than procaine penicillin, two different forms of the drug. The difference between the two forms of the drug is that benzathine penicillin releases the low dose and stays in the patient's system for a long time, while procaine penicillin releases a high dose and is out of the patient's system much earlier. Benzathine penicillin was ideal for treating syphilis because of the lower likelihood of resistance. Treating the disease needed a long-acting drug and not the one that would leave the system quickly. On the other hand, gonorrhea, due to its increasing drug resistance, needed a fast-acting drug that would not stay in the system for long and create an opportunity for the selection of drug-resistant bacteria. Holmes knew how both drugs functioned in vivo and was troubled by the fact that gonorrhea patients were given benzathine penicillin as opposed to procaine penicillin. Holmes had found his second clue. He saw that the sex workers were prescribed the wrong type of penicillin, and this snowballed into a major spread of a particular form of gonorrhea in the Subic Bay. Drug resistance meant that the bacteria would survive a low dose of bacteria of the drug being prescribed. Holmes had to check for one more thing before he would be sure of the cause of resistance. He went to the community pharmacies and asked if the sex workers were coming in and requesting antibiotics on their own, such as benzathine penicillin, without a prescription. His hunch was right. The pharmacists were readily providing the sex workers with benzathine medicine. Not only was the infection being spread, but the sex workers were prescribed the wrong medicine, which led to resistance. The problem was exacerbated by the practice of self-medication and overuse of the same wrong medicine. Now that Holmes had solved the puzzle, it was time to head to the USS Enterprise and report on his findings. He promptly made 3 recommendations. First, he made that the Navy buy nearly 250 specula, one for each patient the doctor saw over the course of each day. He also requested that the Navy buy an autoclave, a machine that would sanitize all instruments overnight, so they would be ready for use the next day. His third recommendation was to institute a method of gram staining on the ship so the doctors would know which bacteria was responsible for the infection. This would quickly ensure that the proper diagnosis of servicemen and thus better treatment. If the patient had non-gonococcal urethritis, then he would get tetracycline, a different drug. If he had gonorrhea, then he would get procaine penicillin combined with probenecid, or tetracycline combined with probenecid. Holmes recommended this addition because penicillin, while effective, is often excreted by the system quickly. And the presence of probenecid ensured that the high dose of the drug stayed in the system long enough to treat the infection completely. Once the new system was instituted, the sailors started to get better. The number of patients with drug-resistant gonorrhea plummeted, and the cross-infection within the examination room sharply declined. War and conflict have always been harbingers of injury and infection, and the desire to save lives of soldiers engaged at the front lines has often been a catalyst for medical advances. Indeed, investigations like Holmes proved essential in the contest between humankind and bacteria. By 1967, he felt a sense of accomplishment about his discovery. His findings led to the infection screening protocols and specific combinations of drug prescription that are used to this day. And yet, drug resistance remained a fundamental challenge as bacteria continued to evolve. Holmes had developed a special bond with the Philippines and its people during the time there in the 1960s. While the Vietnam War was over when he decided to go back to the island nation in the 1990s, its after effects continued in some ways and in other not so obvious ways. Holmes and his colleagues went back to further investigate antimicrobial resistance among sex workers. He wanted to see whether the patterns of disease had spread and whether access to healthcare among the sex workers of the 1990s was different compared to that of the 1960s. The team found that in a 2-year period from 1994 to 1996, resistance against one of the most potent antibiotics of the time, ciprofloxacin, for both gram-positive and gram-negative infections had increased from 9% to 49% amongst the Philippines sex workers. The drug that had been touted by Bayer as a solution to resistance was now proving less and less effective.
Wow, just fascinating. Both the technical details and the way you show the people and all. Oops. Yes, there we go.
Thank you.
This is a common problem too, isn't it? The using the wrong medications or using them not completely.
It is, but it's also important to recognize. So when I started writing the book, Diane, I thought that was a common problem, and it is. But during the course of writing of the book, I realized and I learned that there are many people in many parts of the world who simply don't have the right information. They do not have a doctor to prescribe the medicines. So what you end up with is, in reality, more people dying because lack of access to antibiotics than people dying because of improper use of antibiotics. Right? So let's do a thought experiment. And I had not again appreciated this. Let's imagine a situation where you would expect that everybody would get the right dose. They would be only prescribed by the doctors. The pharmacies would not entertain the idea of self-medication. All of that sounds great. In many parts of the world, there are just not enough doctors to prescribe. And in that case, what should they do, right? So in Pakistan, in the country where I come from, there are not that many primary care physicians or infectious disease doctors. There are very, very few. So if you have an infection, what do? Well, to preserve your health, you go to the pharmacist and you get it. And it's a terrible thing because you don't have information, you don't have knowledge, you take it for 2 days as opposed to 5, all of that. But to be able to solve the problem of not overuse or abuse of drug, you need to have enough doctors in the system who are able to prescribe. So you cannot come up with a rule that everybody needs a prescription when there are not enough people to write that prescription.
Sure.
Wow.
Yes.
And I had not appreciated that while I was, while I was initially starting, because I know and I felt that it is often the fact that people who take antibiotics, they would take it unnecessarily. All of that is true, but there's the other side as well, the inequity in that access.
How do we deal with that problem?
Well, so that's a much harder problem because it's a systems level problem. It's a problem where you need to have enough doctors available in the system, where you need to have enough primary care doctors. So there's something called universal health care or universal health coverage. That is a mission that there is an equity in access. Even in places like Pakistan, Diane and Tom, there is a much greater number of doctors who are available at the city level, in the urban environments, and in the rural environments, right? So there's also a distribution problem.
Yeah.
The number of people who an individual doctor would be able to serve in a large city is high, but it is much smaller than one in the rural areas where the number would be significantly greater. Part of it has to do with incentive structure. Doctors in rural areas are not adequately compensated. The quality of life is different. So it's sort of those issues. But the point I'm making is that we have to recognize those. And if we're able to solve those problems, many of the downstream problems will also see a positive change.
Right. Do you see a way for solving that problem?
I think you start with the general awareness. You start with this recognition that by looking at this problem at the top, at the head, you might be able to influence many problems downstream. And you don't have to be an infectious disease doctor to do that. A nurse can also be trained for that. Increasingly, we are also seeing that some of the tests can be done through remote mechanisms. So new technologies can help. So now let's take it one higher level of that is we need to ensure that we value the lives and health of people who are financially and socioeconomically disadvantaged. So it goes to that part. So if we start with a human rights lens or a human dignity lens, then many of these other things will start to come in place because there will be more investment in having better diagnostics and improvement in care in rural areas. And I think that's an issue where we can make a difference because that, again, as I said, will have impact on many other things as well. Many parts of the world, you don't go to rural areas because because rural areas are not able to offer schooling or good healthcare or good housing to people. So even doctors who are interested would be reluctant to travel there with families because there are no schools for the kids, or the place may not be safe. So if you're able to address those things, there are plenty of people who would be interested in sort of addressing it. And antimicrobial resistance, again, would not be solved simply by the fact that people will start taking medicines appropriately. Not at all. I think it's much more complicated than that. But you will make a dent in sort of the overall aspect by having more people who follow the appropriate guidelines than what happens right now.
Sure. I mean, it would just be very simplistic to think if you take one piece and fix that, everything will be fine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think
Wouldn't that be nice? But that's not the way the world works.
Absolutely. And I think that's very important to recognize, because we have to push back against this notion of simplistic and what are called vertical solutions, right? Focusing only on one thing and imagining that doesn't connect with anything else.
Right.
So that was surprising, that the lack of access to doctors and proper diagnosis, and probably also access to the proper antibiotic, was at least equal to all the other factors. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would say that it's contextual, and part of the argument of the book is that in different parts of the world, different things play a role, right? So this is less of an issue in urban or peri-urban Massachusetts. In Nigeria, other things may be much more important. In Colombia, conflict has really made an impact. So I would say that one of the things we have to appreciate is go with a sense of humility and recognize that context matters, and that a single lens is not going to be able to change everything, but rather it is an appreciation of local culture and local realities. That's, I think, something that we have to pay attention to, that we cannot simply assume that local context is irrelevant and sort of develop and apply tools from a distance. One of my key arguments is that scientists and engineers and doctors and microbiologists need to work with local community and go with that sense of humility that is absolutely essential, rather than with the hubris that we have figured it out and sitting in Boston or New York or London or Geneva, we know how to solve the problems of other parts of the world.
That would also mean involving sociologists and people who study human behavior.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So I would say that's exactly the point. And in some ways, we need to really sort of appreciate that.
Were there any other things that surprised you in your, I'm not sure if research is the right term, but in your assembling of information to make the book?
Well, so I would say there were several. First of all, this notion, this idea that I would say two. One is the problem may seem scientific, but it's much more than science, and science alone will not solve the problem, because development of drug resistance in many ways is a natural phenomena. It happens. It's the overuse and abuse of the problem that gets us there. So in some ways, it's a behavioral problem, not purely a scientific problem. So that's something that we have to understand. That includes greed and hubris and disregard for information and overconsumption of many different things that contribute to it. So that's one. The second one is, so this is sobering, this is sad. The second one is exact opposite of that there are people who I try to sort of list and name in my book who are sort of really working at the front lines for no desire for glory or fame or massive compensation, because they're just outstanding people. They're just exceptional human beings in small labs in Pakistan or in Ghana or in Australia or in Venezuela. These are the real heroes of the whole story. And we all, you, me, Shelley, everybody here is in some ways benefiting from their kindness, from their generosity, from their exceptional dedication.
Wow.
So that's a very important effort to support in the various ways that we can.
Absolutely. I would say that that's really important, because it's critical for us to recognize that there are these people, sort of the unsung heroes of the entire cause, who are just amazing people.
Would you like to pick one of them and talk about what they do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll be happy to do that. Give me 1 second. Just find the passage. So this is about a particular sort of community in, I won't read the whole chapter. It's called A Classless Problem. It's chapter number 21. And I'll read a small section of that. Subtran, a combination of 2 antibiotics, trimethoprim and sulfamethoxazole, was a staple in my childhood home. If I had a fever, I got a tablespoon of that pink syrup. If my throat itched, I got a teaspoon. I never minded that it was sweet, a combination of bubblegum flavor and other additives, and often meant that I would miss school. I outgrew the flavored syrup, but the drug remained always there in the kitchen in the second cabinet from the left. Septran, I learned, was not just for kids, nor was it only available in a pink syrup. There was a tablet form as well, in a blue blister pack with white oval pills. There was never a question of needing a prescription. Anyone could go and buy it from the pharmacy if they could afford it. We were a middle-class family, and a marker of that was a house well stocked with drugs. 3 decades later, little has changed in Pakistan. The pharmacies in my old neighborhood now sell brand names and generics, international brands and local ones. The price of the drug varies, and so does the quality, but the ability to buy them without a prescription remains the same. Local doctors, including many in my own family, are part of the problem prescribing antibiotics when they're going to create more harm than good. Whether the patient presents with a fever, sore throat, or toothache, the family doctor is ready to suggest a course of antibiotics, sometimes simply over the phone. No tests are ever done to determine whether the infection is in fact due to a bacteria. Worse, patients often show up at the pharmacy to get antibiotics themselves without any prescription at all, similar to what Dr. Holmes had observed in Philippines all those years ago. The pharmacists are equally eager to make the sale. In the 1960s, antibiotics started to become widely available in Pakistan and a number of other developing countries. The patents of branded drugs were expiring and new generics were coming to market. Most of the drugs in low and middle income countries were imported at the time, but by the 1970s, the local pharmaceutical companies in a few developing countries were increasing in size and the production rates. In India, the pharmaceutical industry got a big boost in 1970 from new patent laws. The government made it possible for local companies to produce drugs that were still protected by patents by defining patents on process and not on the product. As long as Indian companies were using a different process, they could make something identical to what international companies were making. Indian companies started to reverse engineer in order to come up with processes by which they could make products identical to what was available in more affluent countries. The change in the patent laws made it very difficult for international companies to sue Indian manufacturers for infringement. The boom in the Indian industry created a bigger supply, making the drugs more affordable and accessible, not just in India. In other parts of the world, local and even international pharmaceutical companies eager to increase their sales often push back on the prescription drug laws. The ubiquity of antibiotics, relative affordability, weak regulation, and a lack of enforcement has meant that for many middle-class households, a cabinet well-stocked with antibiotics is the norm. Over time, we started noticing that we had to double the dose of our own antibiotics. Instead of 1 spoonful of Septran, it had to be 2. This problem was not unique to my family. Residents across the city, even those who had far fewer means and resources than we did, were facing a similar challenge. Not far from our home in Islamabad is an urban slum called France Colony. The name of the slum is an accident of history. It is the land that was used to house the French embassy before it moved out to a more secure location. Now, the majority of the people living in France colony are the very opposite of descendants of an affluent Western European nation. Though living in the center of the city, very near to one of its commercial hubs, the residents are part of Pakistan's marginalized Christian population and often targeted, persecuted, and treated poorly by the government and the majority citizens of Islamabad. In France colony, the sewage and drinking water routinely mix. It is an epicenter of disease. Impoverished parents of young children who face threatening infections first do what many families always did. They start with home remedies like medicines like Substandard that do not require a prescription. When those methods fail, the children often end up in the ward of a nearby hospital that is overflowing with patients and often lacks the resources needed to help them. A longtime resident of France colony, Sahiba, name changed to protect her identity, works backbreaking hours as a maid in the house of one of city's elite. When I met Sahiba, she had recently lost her baby to an infection that the doctors at her hospital couldn't effectively treat with any of the antibiotics they tried. Implicitly and explicitly, the doctors blamed Sahiba for exposing the baby to unhygienic environment. Sahiba could do very little about the neighborhood in which she was raising her children, and the pharmacies in the nicer neighborhoods surrounding it continued to sell a steady stream of antibiotics that found their way into medicine cabinets across Islamabad. Sahiba's story is not unique. The resistance rates in the country are staggering, and they ultimately affect everyone. When I was growing up, I never realized that taking a spoonful of Substandard for a runny nose was a problem. I thought it was being proactive in arresting the development of my illness before it became worse. Drug resistance was never mentioned to me, and the drugs were available and seemed to work. Or so I thought. I was of the right sect, the right ethnicity. I lived in a good neighborhood and had access to clean water and sanitation. The same system that failed Sahiba was generous to me and everyone around me. Infections of the sort that threatened Sahiba and her children were lamentable, but inevitable, given the dire levels of poverty in the area. Sahiba and her fellow residents of France colony were often blamed by the elite for the problem of spreading disease. But it was a social system that created abject poverty and a dysfunctional government that failed to prioritize hygiene and public welfare. I didn't realize at the time that my family and I were all guilty through our drug consumption habits. We know now that we were all part of the problem. And the longer we continue to blame the impoverished for the spread of infections around the world, dismissing the ways in which middle class and the wealthy people contribute to antibiotic resistance, the longer it will take to address the problem. We all would be better off if we realize that sometimes it is not the patient's fault. Sometimes it is the fault of the pharmaceutical companies and the governments that should be regulating them. In another slum of a Pakistani city, Lahore, Sadiq was insulted by the report issued by the local health authorities, blaming his father, Aslam, for his own death. His father had died after he took the only recreational drug that he and his friends could afford, a cough syrup. Aslam had been doing this for years. Every weekend, Aslam and a group of his friends, all of them from the same slum, would get together and consume one bottle of cough syrup each. This was their weekly treat. A simple meal of greasy street food, a bottle of a cough syrup that acted as a mild hallucinogen if you took enough of it, and occasionally a card game. Then they would return home and sleep off the effects and go back to the same work the next day, except this time. Sadiq's father came home, had dinner, and never woke up. Nor did any of his friends. More than a dozen people died, all from consuming the exact same cough syrup, coming on the heels of another scandal related to the quality of cardiovascular drugs that had claimed the lives of more than 200 people in Pakistan. The government officials were fearful of more negative publicity, so they swiftly blamed the consumers of the cough syrup. Sadiq was angered by this. The government refused to take any responsibility and announced that Aslam and his friends were all to blame for their own demise. They were addicts, said the provincial health chief. Some went further and called them the scum of the earth, no better than the grave dwellers, lowlifes who were not fully human. A week later, the same problem of a toxic cough syrup emerged in a neighboring city, this time claiming the lives of more than 30 people. Again, the government, supported by the local pharmaceutical industry, dug in its heels and claimed that the lab reports confirming that there was nothing wrong with the syrup. Sadiq challenged the government to publish proof that the deaths weren't linked to the tainted syrup. A couple of newspapers took notice of his challenge, but other events soon crowded him out, and the world moved on. The lax controls of the pharmaceutical companies continued. Near a slum in Lahore stands the Gulab Devi Chest Hospital. That it's named for a Hindu philanthropist has been a thorn in the side of religious zealots. That it's home to one of the largest TB hospitals in the country has ensured its importance in the global confrontation with drug-resistant bacteria. With close to 1,500 beds, the hospital is a continuous state of chaos. Here, doctors treat numerous TB patients, including many who suffer from multi-drug resistant TB. Technically, MDR TB or multi-drug resistant TB refers to infections that no longer respond to the first line of drugs. Rifampicin and isoniazid are the two that are most commonly used. There's a correlation between MDR TB and poverty. For most of the patients who come to Gulab Devi are indeed impoverished. They fit the stereotypical identification of TB in Pakistan. It is a disease of the poor. Kulsoom Bibi was one such patient, and she had been coming to Gulab Devi as a outpatient for over a year. She came from the same area as Sadiq, and like Sadiq, she was poor. She was also treated poorly. Her doctor at the hospital would often speak to her harshly, telling Kulsoom that it was her fault that her infection was not responding to the drugs he prescribed. She must not have adhered to the treatment regime she had been given. Kulsoom Bibi insisted that the opposite was true, that she had been diligent in following the instructions of the doctor. She took great pride in the little education she had, and she told the doctor that she knew how to count and tell time, and that she knew she had taken all the pills on time. Unconvinced, uninterested, and already turning to the other patient, the doctor ended the appointment. The argument about the adherence goes something like this. Those prescribed an antibiotic are supposed to take their drugs for a set and strict period of time. This period is based on experimental and clinical studies that have shown how long patients should take the drugs to kill all of the infectious bacteria. Because some bacteria may take a little longer to die than others, taking the drugs for the full period is critical. Ending the regimen before the period means that some bacteria can and likely will survive and could become resistant. The active part of any drug is called the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API. Inside the body, different drugs release their API at different times. However, if a drug does not release enough API or does not even have enough API, the bacteria would be exposed to an insufficient amount of an antibiotic, an amount that would not effectively kill the whole population. The bacteria that survive can best resist the antibiotic. When the antibiotic kills off most of the competition, the resistant bacteria are free to proliferate, and in some cases even mutate further, moving from partial to complete resistance. The chance of selection of resistant bacteria is the reason why doctors insist that the patient takes their drugs for the entire prescribed period. That is why Kulsoom's doctor was irate. She ruled that Kulsoom was a bad patient who made her once manageable disease a lot more difficult to manage. Worse, by making her disease drug resistant, she was going to expose the people around her to infection, growing even more powerful. But the argument should be looked at another way. What if the drug was only 50% pure? Even if the patient took a full course of antibiotic, doing so would be like taking it for half the prescribed period. The patient may be fully compliant, but the system that was supposed to provide the care had failed the patient. Like cough syrup killing the poor in Lahore, what if the drug and those creating and distributing it were the real problems? So then I sort of go forward into how that discovery was made. And then another chapter, I talk about how, again, in another poor neighborhood, sort of people at the front line discovered how wastewater mixed with sort of the environment led to the development of drug-resistant typhoid, a problem that is still continuing in Pakistan.
Goodness. Goodness. It seems like there's perpetual issues with this, no matter where you go.
They are. But I think at the same time, we also have to recognize that, it's one of those things where everybody has to play a role, that you can't have a situation where some people do their bit and others do not. So we need doctors to be vigilant. We need patients to be compliant. We need the regulatory system to work. And really, it's in some ways, it's like climate change, where everybody has to do their bit. You cannot simply have some people doing it and not others. And that's important. And that's an important lesson because, as I said, science alone wouldn't do it, but policy alone wouldn't do it either.
Right.
And there are some hopeful elements here that I think you emphasize, particularly at the end of your book, but also just now, that people around the world are doing this work to understand what's happening and to understand the situation properly, not just to blame the victim. Essentially, things are more complex. So here, that understanding can be the basis for at least lobbying to change the larger systems.
Absolutely. And, I, despite many challenges and despite sort of a general anxiety about this, I am actually, I would say I'm optimistic. And I do believe that we can bring a change. I do believe that we can sort of change attitudes and behaviors. So I am not at all, I would say, pessimist. I'm certainly concerned, but I would say that there are things that are changing.
So what is it that makes you an optimist?
Well, I think as I mentioned, there are people around the world that are contributing without any fear. I think in some ways the pandemic has increased awareness to infectious diseases. I mean, I say I have I think said this before as well, that back in early 2000s, somebody who wanted to go and become a doctor wouldn't think of infectious disease as something that they wanted to develop their career in. Now it's not the case. Smart young women are going. I mean, I talk about this in the book as well, that I was speaking to a doctor who said in sort of community and county hospitals that they had worked in, you couldn't have enough infectious disease doctors to fill the quota. I mean, there were just not enough good doctors who wanted to work in infectious disease. This is right before COVID. I think that has changed. So I think that is one thing. Of course, it can backfire because people don't want to think about another pandemic. People are concerned. All of that is true. But I think in general, our understanding is improving. I think we also have realized that we need better surveillance systems for disease detection. I think that's important to think about. And I also think that we realized through the pandemic that the only way things work is when people come together, right? So it doesn't get solved if we only are inward looking. So some of those things, despite the enormous cost of the pandemic and the how tens of millions and hundreds of millions of lives have been affected, I would say there is an opportunity to reflect, and that's good, and that I think is something to recognize.
What do you mean by medical surveillance?
So, for example, if something happens in a far corner of a country, that information would be quickly shared. That wasn't the case before, right? That wasn't the case because your systems were disconnected. Your systems were not responding to a challenge. You would often sort of not pay attention to it immediately.
Right. So that means, therefore, if there's an odd case that comes in or a disease that's not usually in an area, everyone would know, hey, this is coming to a place where it shouldn't be. So they'd be more on the lookout for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Or I've come across this thing and I don't know what it is. Have you come across?
Exactly. Or the fact is that you would say that it is not only in one place that it is. You're seeing pockets of this. So you're not treating it as one-off isolated incident.
There also seem to be developments that during the pandemic, there was a lot of testing and reporting, but that's kind of been greatly reduced. So now there are some other techniques, such as monitoring virus in wastewater or sewage,
Absolutely.
that have been given greater emphasis to just because of the pandemic. So while the whole situation was pretty awful, that's at least one positive thing that came out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think of one other thing from your book. You mentioned how in one or more of the Scandinavian countries, they've taken a very hard look at managing the use of antibiotics, and they've reduced the overuse. So the antibiotics are only used when really appropriate and necessary. And they've also noticed a decline in the amount of antibiotic resistant microorganisms. So to me, that was another extremely hopeful sign.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think as I said, there are pockets of encouragement, but I would say is my optimism is I have to be slightly careful about it because of two reasons. One is we need to make sure that, as I said, everybody participates. You cannot be only relying on Scandinavia or only relying on one country or the other. And two, we have to be able to reflect deeply on our own behavior. That means that there is, we have to recognize an increased use of antibiotics in the veterinary sector, in sort of animal husbandry and in sort of poultry farming and in sort of cattle farms. And that has to be taken very, very seriously. I think we cannot simply brush it aside. As a matter of fact, in this country and many other parts of the world, the consumption of antibiotics in the veterinary sector exceeds the consumption in the human sector. So we have to reflect on the behavioral part of this as well. We have to recognize that we cannot simply assume that the problem would go away without a deeper reflection on how we choose to live our lives. And that's important. So one is to take it seriously, two is to have that, and three is that we have to play by rules that apply to everyone. So we cannot sort of put the burden disproportionately on poor countries without not doing our fair share. One of the things that I learned and I reflected on it. So we were talking to these farmers in Bangladesh, and they said that, it's all of a sudden now we are under pressure to produce more, but cannot use antibiotics, right? At the same price. Yeah. And for us, economically, it doesn't make sense, because if we are to sort of either produce more, we have to use antibiotics that increase production. So if you're telling me that I shouldn't use antibiotics, how do I make up for that difference? So we have to recognize that there are lives affected. And if we want to make sure that we're changing behavior, we should be able to incentivize that behavior change. Otherwise, people will not do that. And if the margins are very thin for that farmer in Bangladesh, we have to respect that, and we have to make sure that we are able to provide viable ways for them to continue to maintain their business and not sort of go in loss, because we in the US do not want them to use antibiotics, right? So we cannot sort of just have an unfair way of approaching this. Yeah. We should be willing to pay more if you want to have antibiotic-free meat, but that money should also go to the farmers so that they are also able to make the right decisions.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So you're actually talking about agriculture. When you talk about veterinarians, I think about all the drugs that are used for different diseases that are in the dogs and the cats and the birds and
more of the pets.
Not the ag.
No, I'm talking about sort of the animal farming for consumption, less on the individual pets, but it's the same argument that you're using it for disease treatment. And my position is not that there should not be any antibiotic use in the case of animals, because if there is an infection that needs to be treated by the antibiotic, it's only an ethically appropriate thing to do that. There's no question that we should. The real issue is that are we using it under the guise of treatment? We're using it for growth promotion, and that's where the problem comes from.
Sure, and that's a whole different issue than actual. Yeah, it's interesting because people have gotten a lot actually in this country about using so much care and chemo and other things for pets, which we don't really think about. When you don't have money, you're not going to spend $5,000 on a chemo treatment for your dog. You know, it's just, it's not going to happen. And the same thing happens with antibiotics, and not just antibiotics. I mean, that's not the only medicine that are being abused and is overused and running into problems, though we see it with antibiotics more than any others.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. This is fascinating. There's such a need. Well, it really is. That's an interdisciplinary need, and it's people don't generally work interdisciplinary.
Well, I think we have to realize that the problems that we see, even in the domain of health, are not simply in the domain of health. I think they are truly interdisciplinary and require us to understand things from all perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've emphasized several times that it's a system level problem, and that things like social policy and a willingness to work for the good of other people are important. And no single one of them can fully address the problem, but at the very least, this is a system level problem that we have to think about differently.
Absolutely. I would agree 100%.
Mhm. This is just fascinating. I'm so glad that you bring this information forward, especially to us laymen, because it's very important, and it's not necessarily approachable for everybody, but you make it that way, and that's really, thank you. That's vital.
Well, I'm glad that you liked the book, that you thought it was worthy. I'm just absolutely delighted.
Are you working on another book possibly, or thinking about
Yeah,
it?
so I am. There's another one that is coming out later this year in late fall, focusing on sort of access or denial of access of healthcare among refugees. It's a combination of some research, but also lots of interviews and field work. I can leave the connection. It's called "We Wait for a Miracle." I'll share this here. Here.
That's really a great title too, because when you're a refugee, there's so much going on.
Yeah, it's part of a phrase that from one of the interviews.
So is it going to be like the second half of this year, or late in the year?
I mean, right now it says November 7th. I think it's going to be more like October, November. So towards sort of mid-fall. So in about 6-7 months, I'd say.
Cool. I look forward to seeing your book and reading it.
I look forward to hearing what you think of it, and would be glad to come and talk. Absolutely.
Oh, cool.
Sure. Well, we have, I'm sharing it right here now with everyone. We do have our bookstore, which we'll try to put it on shortly. But that's great. I mean, these are such important issues to be talking about. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. It's my absolute pleasure.
And we're also grateful to all our sponsors for making this program possible. And I will bring their names up shortly, because that's really an important thing to do. Oh, goodness, I've lost them. Hold on. I think it's on the other side here. Yes, that's what I did. They're over here. Here we go. Amy Lamb, Shelley Payson, Robin Rubendunst, Susan Belkin, Helen Fremont, Carol Scott, Philip Thibault, Lois Welber, Anita Banglanes, Marianne Dornice Goldman, Galina Sakes, and the Concord, Dracut, North Reading, Westford, and Wilmington Cultural Councils, using funds from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, Anonymous, and Diane Song. If you'd like more information about Dracut Arts, please go to our website, dracutarts.com, or email us at dracutarts@gmail.com. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
It's been fascinating.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me and for everything that you guys do. It's great.